Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome again to this session on of our AWS Cloud Practitioner Challenge by WeFund Cloud. Today, we'll be looking at Module 2, Identity and Access Management, but actually this will also include overview of AWS services and interacting with AWS. So let's go ahead and see what we have on the objectives. So as I say, we'll have an overview of AWS services, then an introduction to IAM. What is an IAM user, an IAM group, an IAM role, IAM policy, MFA, which is multi-factor authentication, interacting with AWS, best practices, labs, and we want to get you people at least doing something immediately. So there will be a lab that I'll come up with and encourage all of you to show you how to register and try to get your hands dirty before we meet on Friday in the morning to do it. So just an announcement, we'll have labs this week on Friday at the same time. Just keep that in mind, yeah. Then there will be some revision question and as usual assignment for what you can read in preparation for tomorrow. So let's get started, yeah. So overview of AWS services, but just a gentle reminder of what we said about cloud computing last week. We said it's the on-demand delivery of IT resources over the internet with pay-as-you-go pricing. But the question is, what are IT resources, right? IT resources here will be compute, storage, databases, analytics, networking, mobile developer tools, management tools, Internet of Things, that is IoT, you learn that along, security and enterprise applications. That is what we refer to as IT resources here. And in general, Amazon Web Services, which is AWS, the cloud provider, offers a broad set of global cloud-based products. And this can be from data warehousing to deployment tools, directories, and to content delivery. So when you think of cloud computing, again, just want to reemphasize what we mean by these IT resources. So when we're talking about AWS, we'll be looking at what are these IT resources that are available that we need, that we can get through on-demand. And just for historical purposes, AWS actually started offering what was referred to as IT infrastructure services to businesses as a web service in around 2006. That was in March. And the first service, which is always something to remember, was what is called S3. And you can read more. There's an article I've put here that was released in regards to this. So the very first service that AWS had as an offer was in March 2006. And at the moment, there are over 200 AWS services that you can quickly provision without paying any fixed expenses upfront. So remember, the advantage we said about cloud computing is that you change capital expense to variable expense. So you don't need to invest so much capital in the beginning. You just pay for what you use, and this can be variable. So there are over 200 of those services at the moment. And as you in your cloud journey, the key thing is you'll be trying to know what are these services, what are they doing, and how can you use them to maybe solve business problems. Yeah, so when you're thinking of AWS, there are some topics here you'll see more in detail, for example, global infrastructure tomorrow. But just to highlight that when you think of AWS, it's a cloud infrastructure that is built around what is called AWS regions and availability zones. So when you're thinking of the entire infrastructure, remember that in traditional IT, you always have your data center, beside the company, and then you have the entire infrastructure, right? That is required. So AWS run on some infrastructure, and this infrastructure is built around the world because it's a global offering. And this infrastructure comes around regions and then availability zones. So a region is normally a physical location that will contain multiple availability zones. So you see more about that tomorrow, but just the definition here, you have a region is more of a physical location that will have multiple availability zones. And what will be an availability zone? Availability zone will consist of one or more discrete data centers with redundant power, networking, and connectivity housed in separate facilities. So when you're thinking of AWS services, you should also keep in mind that they are running on some infrastructure. Yeah. But I'm just giving an overview. Details will come in following models. So you also have what is called, AWS. The key thing about cloud providers is security. And it is a very important topic for most of the customers. And AWS have been able to demonstrate that it's built, this infrastructure is built in kind of a very secure manner and offers some foundational services that if you want to meet some particular security needs, you are able to do that in the cloud. So companies may address security differently. And what AWS does, they will offer services that will help you meet the kind of security that you are looking for. So security in the cloud is similar to that you have in data centers, but the only thing here again is that you are not maintaining facilities and hardware. And of course, staff, because security in on-premises means, you need the facilities, the hardware, you need the staff that understand security to manage that. So in the cloud, you don't have these facilities and hardware to deal with. As well, you always know in the cloud, you don't manage these things. It's more of software based. So in the cloud, you don't have to manage physical servers or storage devices. You just use software based security tools to monitor and protect the flow of information that's moving in and out of your cloud resources. And then something you learn in more detail when you do the security model is that AWS offers some sort of shared responsibility model, right? And these are just the key of this statement. AWS manages what is called security of the cloud, which means the entire infrastructure that AWS has built around the world, they manage it and protect it, right? Like where you have data centers, they ensure that people cannot break into it, or you can have attacks to that physical infrastructure. So AWS will manage security of the cloud, and customers will be responsible for security in the cloud. So security in the cloud here means that they are the ones who select the kind of services they want to use that will meet the security that they are looking for. So when you come to learn more about security, you read some of these services that work with security in the cloud and what these services are. But just as an overview, security of the cloud is done by AWS, and security in the cloud is done by the customer. So there's a shared responsibility. Both of these have to come hand in hand to achieve the required responsibility. The other thing you come to also realize is AWS have to comply with lots of control that are offered by organizations, such that when AWS says they are doing a particular thing, it is actually what they're doing. So these are independent third-party organizations that look into what AWS is doing. So compliance helps you understand the controls in place for security and data protection, which is very important for customers. It's also a shared responsibility, and it is designed in alignment with best security practices and a variety of IT security standards. So this will be a point where you learn some of the security programs that AWS will have to comply with. These are just some of the names you'll see here. I'll share a link after that you will look into, but it's just to give you an overview that it's not just AWS, but every cloud provider try always to meet some of these compliance, which are kind of like regulations from third party, so that to give customers confidence that when the organization says that they are doing things this way, you can always refer to these documents and see how they are complying to that, which can then give confidence in using the cloud providers, the resources that they offer. So yeah, this will be in form of white papers, certifications, accreditations, and third-party attestations. So that is just an overview here. Any questions so far? I hope this is just straightforward.
Hi.
Okay. Hi, Elsie.
Yeah.
Hi, Maureen. Hi, good morning.
Yeah, when you talk of security where the clients have to do some security themselves, does it mean that the clients have to just selecting the cloud services, it's the ones that are already secured, or when they select, they need to do some coding?
Good question. So when they select the cloud services, there are cloud services that will help them implement a particular type of security. So there are a variety of services, like we have talked about compute, and there are storage, but they themselves don't yet offer maybe a particular security that a customer will want. Then what AWS will do is they will offer another service that is just to help you configure a particular type of security that you are looking for. So they are selecting a service that is more focused in the area of security, and then selecting that service, they will help configure or implement a kind of security model that they want. Yeah.
Okay, at their own level now.
Yes, at their own level. So that's why they say security in the cloud, and it's yes, where they select services. Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good. Let's go ahead. I don't see any hand up. So, yeah, let's have a step back and think of see overview of AWS and yeah, what this is. So remember, it's on demand. When you're talking of cloud computing, it's on demand of IT resources, right? We've said compute, storage. We're just talking of services individually. So AWS, think of AWS as Lego blocks. Hopefully, many of you know what these are. Yeah, these are just simple. They appear simple in appearance, right? So AWS services are like these Lego blocks. You just see them lying around. They don't offer much functionality on their own. They just have maybe one function, like storage would just be for storage. But when you start putting Lego blocks together, you can build very complex and amazing kind of structures. It's the same thing with AWS. The services are quite unique in functionality, but when you start combining those services, you start building particular some kind of structures that address particular business problems. And that is what you come to learn along what solution architecting is. Solution architecting is listening to a customer, understanding their business problem, and then coming back and being able to put AWS services together that will form a kind of solution that will address that business problem, maybe for whatever thing they are looking for. So in a much more simple term, AWS services are like Lego blocks, and when you combine these blocks together, you start form kind of structures or architectures that will be able to address particular business problems. So building blocks will be the storage, the compute, the networking, security, monitoring, media, processing, analytics, and AI there for artificial intelligence. So all these blocks that AWS have, remember the IT resources we mentioned earlier, these are these building blocks. When you put them together, they are able to address a particular problem. So, and that's what solution architecting is, being able to combine blocks to form, being able to combine AWS services that will be able to maybe solve a particular problem. Yeah. So that's how you should think of AWS services. And when you learn these services, the practice in the practitioner level, you will realize that we'll talk about the services individually, but as a look ahead for each one of you, when you learn a particular service, always try to see how does it connect to another service. Maybe, and you realize that how does it connect to another service, maybe to solve a certain problem. So that's what you kind of be experiencing. But at this level, we'll mostly be defining each of the individual services. But as you move in your journey, you'll be thinking of how can you combine the services and what kind of problem will they be able to solve. And yeah, we said AWS have about 200 services. Yeah, you always see them in icons as well. At times at the beginning, these icons will be intimidating, but as you start learning, when you see them, you recognize them. You know, you hear of a service like AWS Lambda. It will always write it as AWS Lambda, but when it's represented, this will be what we'll be looking for AWS Lambda, for example. You know, you hear of S3 storage, you know, most of the time in the structure, they don't have to write S3 storage, but this is what will be for storage. So when you learn the services, at the beginning, as I say, it will be intimidating to know knowing the icon that matches to it, so that when you look in an architectural diagram, you immediately recognize what it is, will also be, yeah, something of interest. So, yeah, so these are like those Lego blocks, and there are about 200 of them. And yeah, Lego, as I say, they're in simple functionality. And then when you'll be combining those Legos, you will be able to address you can have very highly complex and practical applications that will be solving particular problems. So that is just a kind of way. I have a reference here where you can read more about this article. It was quite a very interesting analogy. The other thing I want to mention about services is that when you think of AWS services, they're always classified in three particular areas. You have what is referred to as a global service, a regional, or a zonal service. Right? You have a global. So when you learn about an AWS service, you should always ask yourself what kind of service it is. Is it a global service? Is it a regional service? Or is it a zonal service? Those are the key things. And global will mean that it covers all the AWS regions in the world. When you do AWS infrastructure tomorrow and learn of all the different regions, you actually understand more what this means. And a regional service means that the resource is only applicable to one specific region. And a zonal service will mean it exists only in one availability zone. So those are just definitions you should keep in mind. And to know there are 200 services, you know, trying to classify which one will be global, which one will be zonal, which one will be regional. You can imagine already how complex that will be, but there is a tip. The number of global services are not really many. So if you can remember this, like IAM that we'll be looking today is a global service. You come to learn of security token service, which is STS. It's another service. If you notice, I'm writing the short abbreviations, and I know this may also be intimidating, especially for many of you who maybe have not done an IT and where you meet a lot of abbreviations like this, but you get used to it. So at times you always learn the name in full and also in a short format. So these are all the global services. IAM, STS, and all of them have particular functionality. We're not covering that now. Route 53, CloudFront, Lambda Edge, and WAF. These are all the global services that you can have of. And zonal services is what is called EC2, Elastic Compute here. This Elastic Cloud Compute, you'll be treating next week. EBS, this is for storage, Elastic Block Storage, volumes. So when you think of zonal services, there are just two services. So if you know the global services and if you know the zonal services, you are already covered. Because if a service is not global and if a service is not zonal, then that service is regional, right? So that is just a tip of how to know which service is global and which service is zonal. All you need to do is remember the global services and then the zonal services. If you can remember this, then any other service that doesn't fall under these examples or out of the 200 will be a regional services. Okay. And then there is a link here that takes you to the PDF file of an overview of AWS services. What I know the services that it covers is more than all the services that you have in, let me see, that you have in for the practitioner. But what I'll encourage you is, I know most of you will not stop your journey in the practitioner. So what I'll encourage you is, yeah, you can just decide if you are just studying a page or two a day, looking at these services. So if you come, for example, and start reading about services that fall under Amazon Web Services Cloud here, sorry, yeah, yes, analytics, right? The different services here, look at what accessing web service applications, integration, containers, contact centers. This may look much, but in most cases, just knowing what, for example, Amazon Athena is, you know, you read what that service is, what it can do. Amazon Cloud Search, you read what that service is and what it can do. Amazon EMR, remember there are 200 of those services, but if you start practicing to read what each services is and know what it's doing, it will be building a very solid foundation, not just for the practitioner knowledge that you need to pass the exam, but for higher courses. So it's just 95 pages. I'll encourage most of you to download this and keep it very close at heart, and maybe just learn 2 or 3 services a day, you know what they are doing, 2 or 3 services a day, and try to always maybe go back and try to remember what have you learned about the service. And then, but in preparation for the cloud practitioner exam, we'll always cover or refer to you most of the services that you need to know. But we are not just focusing on the exam. That's why I encourage that. Keep this beside you and try to study and learn as more services as you can. You can always access the link here. Good, enough about an overview of AWS and the services. Let's look at IAM, which is one of the first services that we will learn today. Yes, go ahead, Napoleon.
I wish to ask, you talked about the global, the zonal, and the regional.
Yes.
Is the cloud, this zonal and regional? We understand that global is maybe whole wide world.
Right.
When the zonal or regional, is it not just like Northwest region or cloud classification is different? When we are thinking maybe in terms of cloud, is zonal, what can we think of when we talking about zonal and regional? Thank you.
No, yeah, very good question. That will be, if you won't mind, this definition from AWS on what a region is, right? So they have their own definition of a region. They have their own definition of what zonal is. I just gave an overview there of what in the global infrastructure, which is a model that will be covered tomorrow by Lady N. And tomorrow she will give a clear definition of what is a region, what is annual, as well as what is zonal. So as you've rightly said, global will be covers the whole world here, and which will means all AWS regions. Yeah, because there is also, when she'll be treating that, you realize that global, even we say global as all regions, you realize that China is treated differently. So this global will not involve China, for example, they have their own specialized regions. So if you wouldn't mind, just hold on for tomorrow or read the assignment that we'll have today to start understanding what is the definition from AWS on what the region is and what is the definition of what a zone is. That will be covered tomorrow. Yeah. Thank you. I understand. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So let's look into the first AWS service. We did talk about IAM. Who remembers the kind of service IAM is? It falls under what kind of service? We just pointed that out. Is it a global, regional, or zonal service?
IAM is under the
Global.
global.
Global, good, thanks for that. Yeah, thanks for that. So let's talk about the service IAM, identity and access management. What is it, and what is it, as we say, what is it about to offer? So IAM is a web service that will enable you to manage access to AWS resources and services and resources in a secure manner. So remember, cloud computing is the on-demand delivery of IT resources over the internet, right? You have to access them over the internet. So how do you access them? IAM is that service that is responsible for you to help you access those resources. And the other key thing is accessing them in a secure way. So IAM will be able to give control on who can be authenticated, which means signing in, and who can be authorized, who has permissions to use resources. So there are always two sides of the coin here. You have the authentication first, which is being able to sign in, and then authorization. Signing in is, okay, you are recognized, you can be able to access. But then the other thing is there are 200 services, and the question is, what are you permitted, or or how are you permitted to use those resources? Then, which is the second aspect of it. So when you think of the key things that IAM controls, one is authentication, and then the other one is authorization. And the interesting thing is that you can use IAM at no additional charge. So it's a free service. It's one of those services that you don't pay for in AWS when you're using. And as we have said, it's a global service. So in general, that is what IAM as a service is. Remember, it's just simple. A service on its own is just simple. It offers a particular functionality. And that is what we have in IAM here. It controls authentication and authorization. Yeah, yes, I think I had this twice. So with IAM, you have what is always referred to as the AWS root user. So I want us to define this. Now, we'll learn how to create an AWS account. And what you realize is that it is, you always want to have what is referred to as an AWS root user. And this is actually an identity that has complete access to all AWS resources in your account. So to be able to use AWS or access AWS services, you will have to create what is called an AWS. You have what is called, you have to sign up, right? And when you sign up, you have an account. And that account is then gives you the possibility to access whatever services or resources that AWS have. And when you sign up for the very first time, when you are signing up in AWS, you always create, as I said, you create an account, and the first user that you will have will be what is referred to as the AWS root user. So it's like the master user, right? That account has access to almost everything. So that the AWS root user is created or is identified when you are setting up an AWS account in the beginning. And yeah, this is always you always use the email address and the password to access the root account. You always have use the email address and the password to sign in, right? So when we go to creating an AWS account, you get to understand this more. It's just think of signing up, right? When you want to sign up, you have I'll show that in the lab session today, but just think of a root user as that very first user that you use when you create your account for the very first time. And this root user is always identified by an email address, and of course you always create a password that you use as a combination when you want to sign to the root account. And just immediately as a best practice, this account is very powerful. Remember, it's a master account. But what is strongly recommended is that you should never use the root user for everyday task, right? Even administrative ones. The root user, when you create it, it is just like your very first account, but immediately you create that user, you should create what is referred to as IAM user, which will have administrative privileges. And this is what you'll be using to do all other, that you use into doing all other tasks, right? And then what you do with the root user is you log the credentials and use them to perform only few account and service management tasks that can only be done by the root user. There are some tasks that can only be done by the root user, but these tasks are not many, right? I mean, remember the root user is the master user, right? It has access to everything. But then if you create an IAM and main user, which is just another user with administrative privileges, it can cover up most of the tasks that you need. But there are some particular tasks that you may need to use with the root user. So what is recommended is you always lock down the credentials of the root user and keep. The reason is for security purposes. If someone have the root user credentials and log into your account, they can basically wipe off everything, right? So it is always handled with care. So one thing you should remember about the root user as a best practice is that you don't use it in doing all the administrative tasks. You always lock it immediately once you get in. Yeah, so keep that in mind. Any question about this, just to make sure that no one is getting worried? The first thing is you use that to sign up. That's when you create the root user comes up when you sign up. But when you sign up and have this, you just lock that account. And then you create what is called an IAM user, which is an IAM with maybe a user which has administrative privileges. You see that along the line, especially in the labs. Just keep that in mind. And then you use that for carrying most of the tasks that you have. Okay. So that's about, yes, go ahead, Alvin. You have your hand up. Yeah.
All right. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My worry is with the IAM user and the root user. Is there something on the dashboard, something like a display that will be able to tell you that as it is, you are signed into a root user or into an IAM user? Maybe if you get confused along the way, is there something that will be indicating that this account you are presently using is an IAM user account or a root user account? Thank you.
Good question. Yes, there is. And that will always come from when you look at the drop down, when we sign in, just remember me to show that, right? When you look at an account, you can always see what kind of user that is currently signing. Yeah. So that there is that possibility to see once you sign into the console. But we'll see more of that when we start doing the hands-on. And just remind me on Friday, as I say, we'll have a lab session this Friday to show that. Yeah. Any other question?
Yeah. Is it a fragility of the root user account that makes it not to be used to do administrative works, or is it that it is limited in having access to administrative works?
Yeah, good question. The thing is, the root user is like the master user, right? It has complete control over the account. You can actually, for example, one thing you can do with the root user, if you create an AWS account and you no longer use it and you no longer need it, what you can do is you can use the root user to delete that account, right? So the thing is, the root account have access to everything in your account. So it's very powerful, and the reason why it's much more better to keep it is because of the power it has, right? You can do anything that any account like an IAM and main user that you create, whatever thing you can do, the root user can do and more. So the root user has a complete control over all services and resources. So it is with the root user that you can delete, for example, the account if you no longer need it. So it is because it's much more powerful, it comes with a lot of security risk, because if it is compromised, let's say if someone who is trying to hack in your organization have access to it, it means they'll have complete control over all your resources. They can hold you to ransom, right? You may be able to have, or they can decide and just wipe out everything that you have configured. So that is the reason why it's good to secure the root user, is because of the power it has. And then you create other users that just have particular permissions. You come to learn about what is referred to as least privilege later. But again, answering your question, is the power of the root user that you have to restrict, or it's better to just keep it aside. Yeah.
Hello.
Okay.
Yeah, hello. Good. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Who is next?
According to my understanding, the root user gave you access to an account, and then IAM is an account inside the root user account, right?
Yes, you can say so. It's a subset. IAM still give you access to the account. The root users give you access to the account. But you can say, in terms of when you say IAM is, I'll say IAM, the permissions of an admin IAM account, for example, is a subset of the permissions that the root user will have. Yeah.
Because I was saying it because if you have if you create an account with the root user, and then now you already have IAM inside the account, and then now you want to log into the IAM user account, how will you then log in? Will you log through the root account before logging into the IAM account?
Okay. No, good question. Now I get what you say. Yeah. So what happens is, when you create an account and you have the root user, right? When you get access to the account, what you do is, with the root user, once you are signing with the root user, you will create with the root user credentials that you've used to sign into the account, and you are inside the account, you create an IAM user with maybe administrative privileges. And then this account will receive its own username and password, for example. And then you can then sign out from the account. And then when you want to log into the account, you log in with the administrative account that you created, which has its own username and password. So when you are signing into the account, you don't use the root user account to sign in first before the IAM. You sign in with the IAM and a user that with his own username and password. Yeah. So you don't need to do a two-way process.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good, Mustafa. Good. Well, you'll see more of that when we immediately will do the hands-on. So your questions is helping me to think of some of the things to show on Friday. So just remind me if you are looking for this, or if I'm missing it out. But thanks for that question again.
I think Ban.
Yes.
Yeah. From what I see, I think I can remember one example related to IAM user root and IAM. In such a situation, I believe some organization like the HR, he or she has the total access into the employee's accounts. Say she's the one that created the account in the system. She have already you have ideas about individual accounts. So now this is like an example of she or he having the IAM user root power. But now you come to the other side with the IAM user. Now the IAM user now could be one of the employees, or the employees, they have their own personal accounts. In case they have a problem in the system, they cannot log into the account. The HR now with the IAM user root account, she can be the one to solve the problem into the employees' login situation.
Right.
I've noticed one company.
Yeah, that's an analogy, a good one. Just thinking of in terms of permissions, where the HR has more powers than individual employees. Yeah. So yeah, Good analogy there. Hope it helps for your understanding.
And just to add, sorry, I didn't see the name of the person who just spoke. So it's like you have, let's say at your workplace, you have an IT administrator will be an example of that, your root user, because with the IT administrator, it gives rights to what all the users in that department are allowed to do. And if there's anything with your account as a user, you have your own credentials to log in, but you can maybe not install some softwares or so. So that gives also an analogy of what the root user is. So you have all the powers that you can do a lot of things, delete people, install something. But then someone who is just using it, you have the credentials and you just have certain privileges, or you are allowed to do particular things. You cannot just delete somebody. So that also, I think, maybe helps to clarify what a root user is and what an IAM user. So the root user, you create an IAM user that will be like a subset of the root user. I hope I'm not confusing here. So it's like your IT administrator here, and then giving you the permissions to log into your company system, kind of.
Excellent.
Thank you. That is another good side about it. Thank you.
Can I add just a comment to what Vero just said?
Yes, sir.
I have an example at work here. I'm using Okta to actually get into my work platform. And when we have a new application that we want to use, or new system that we want to use to work with, all we do is we go to Okta and write, can I have this app installed on my Okta? And then a few minutes later, somebody will Slack you and say it's already on your dashboard. So when I refresh it, that particular application is already ready for me to use in the dashboard. So that means I am the IAM user, and then there is someone who has a root authorization who actually allows those permissions for me to access those platforms.
Great. Very great examples. Thanks, Serge. Hope that brings more clarification on the power of the root user and then admin user. So one has sub permissions, right?
So I have a question. Good morning, everyone.
Good.
It's about the security. You had the global and in-service security. So can you please clarify me on this? Is it that we have both the two, global and in-service security?
Wait, global and in-service security?
Yeah, like if I'm not mistaken, you made something of the logo blocks. Like there are some securities that are in service, right?
Okay, let me see, just a moment. That is, when I did Lego blocks, I said, just remind me.
But I think it's about where you mentioned that you have security of the cloud and security in the cloud.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Vero does right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. Let me touch on this again. So when I talk of security of the cloud, right? You come to, like I mentioned, you have AWS when you think of AWS, there's an infrastructure where all these services are running in, right? You still have, so when you think of the cloud, it's not the cloud in the sky, so to say. It's also still, it's just traditional IT, but in more of a way, in a global way and addressed completely differently. So you still have data centers. Remember, in traditional IT, you have data centers. Now, with a cloud provider, you have data centers that are worldwide, and these data centers, you learn more tomorrow, are kind of grouped into zones, and then also group again, and the zones are grouped into regions. Now, in traditional IT, you have you need to take care of the infrastructure, right? The infrastructure itself has to be secured, which is what is referred to as security. If you have just one data center, securing it like physical access, who can have, who is securing the windows, who is ensuring that the doors are always locked. So in the same thing in AWS, with the data centers and all the regions, you have to ensure security of that, which is why you say security of the cloud. So security of the data centers, right? And ensuring that nothing happens into them. That is what we say secure AWS managed security of the cloud. But then when you as an organization, right, you pick AWS and you want to work, right? Each organization have different different ways in which they want to handle security. So what will happen is that among the 200 services that AWS offers, there are some services that are just to help in configuring security the way you want it. And then when an organization pick a particular service, they can then configure security the way they want. And that's why it says security in the cloud. So an organization is responsible for security in the cloud. So the services that they will, and this will depend on the services they select and how they will configure those services. So this kind of security services that will select and how they will configure them in order to manage, to reach the goal or the kind of security that they want. So when you think of security of the cloud, think of managing and protecting the global infrastructure that AWS runs in. And then when you think of security in the cloud, it is now customers, how they are trying to address security to suit their organizational needs, the security that their organization require them to have. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Right. So again, this is just a topic. There's still what you have the security. I just shared this as an overview. There's what you have the security model that will cover all of this. And I see there's a link that Vero has shared on the shared responsibility. If you want to study ahead, go ahead and look at that. It will help you immediately, but there's still a model that will cover security. And what I just did was just an overview here for now. Yeah. Okay. So let's move ahead so that we're able to cover this, but thanks so much for your questions and for your engagement, and that interest. At least it makes it much more lively and knowing that, yeah, I'm not alone. So let's go ahead and talk about IAM user, right? We were here, we talked about the root user. So let's talk about we'll just talk about best practices of the root user, about locking that away. And I think everyone now sees the reason is just that it's a very powerful account, very powerful, has very powerful permissions, and you need to be able to manage that differently. So when you, as I said, when you sign in with the root user, you can create what is called an IAM user. Someone is asking for the link for the AWS practitioner Telegram group. I'm sure you should be, if not, you'll be added later. So just hold on to that. Yeah, we'll come back to that. I'll share that to you at the end, sorry. So let's talk about the IAM user. So it is just an entity that you create with AWS to represent the person or application that uses it to interact with AWS. Remember that you have AWS services, you need to interact with them. Yeah, those services that AWS is offering, you need to be able to interact with them. So an IAM user can represent maybe a person, right? Or at times it can represent an application. Remember that you may have an application that maybe needs to access some particular AWS resources or maybe interact with other services. So when you think of an IAM user, it is not just a person. It can not only be a person, it can also be an application that will be able to use it. And it always consists of a name of the credentials. And then, and this is so what will happen is controlling the same thing, authentication and authorization. Authentication, the process of you using your username and maybe your password to sign in, that's a process of authentication. But after you have authentication, the next step is what are you authorized to do? Which will be something you'll learn, we'll just talk about later, policies. will give you permissions on what you can do after you authenticate. So when you always think of IAM, always remember that it's two ways. The authentication phase, just because you have been recognized and you have signed in doesn't mean now you have access to everything. There's still a limitation which is given by the authorization. Then you have what is also called IAM user have permanent keys. You come to see what these permanent keys are. So this is completely different from your password, but permanent keys here is used at times when you have to do programmatic access using the command line. But for now, before when we do the command line and then when we demonstrate how to use the AWS command line, you see how these permanent keys come to play. So when you're thinking of being able to do programmatic access to AWS, that is maybe using the command line or what is also called SDK will come to add, you need this permanent, you need these keys for access. So we'll demonstrate that later, but for now, just understand that an IAM user always have permanent keys. We'll come to that more later. So yeah, we've talked about user credentials, and with user credentials, you always have the console password. A password is just what you type in to an interactive session, such as the management console. You see the management console in display also in our labs. But I'll try to, yeah, and then the access keys is the combination of access key. You also come to learn about what is referred to as access keys, and access keys is just a combination of an access key ID and a secret access key. And you can sign to a user at a time, and this can be used to make programmatic calls. So that's what we were just talking about. So the permanent keys here, which are access keys, is always a combination of an access key ID and a secret access key. And this can be used to make programmatic calls. So this is completely different from the console password, but this will be much more clear when you see how that is in use, right? But what I want you to capture at the moment is the definition of an access key. When you hear access key, what are you talking of? It's a combination of an access key ID and a secret access key. That's what you should always have in mind. And this can be used to make programmatic calls. So this is more of just a definition, you know? Yeah, so let's talk about IAM groups. So now that when you understand what an IAM user is, right, you start thinking of what is, the next step is a group. So you can have many users, and then what you can do is you can collect these users into a group. So an IAM group is just a collection of IAM users, because like we said, maybe a search, as he was talking about where he is and working, maybe there could be many of them that are having particular permissions, right? So maybe there are many people or maybe colleagues of Sage, for example, and all of them need just particular permissions. So you collect all of those people in one group. So if you are thinking of, I have that example coming up of a department, maybe if you're thinking of the IT department, or you're thinking of the different in an organization, you always have different departments, and these different departments will have particular kind of permissions, right? So rather than giving permissions to individuals, you can collect all these people in a group, and what you can do is offer permission to that group. So an IAM group is just a collection of users, and the key thing of doing that collection is to easily manage kind of permissions, so that you don't, because when you think of organizations, you may have about 200, 300, 400 people in a particular department, or 400 people that require a similar permissions. And if you were to go around in applying individual permissions to these users, it will be a very big task for 400 people. So what you can do is you create just a group where all of them belong to, you apply permissions in the group, and everyone that is inside that group will be immediately inherit those permissions. So that's what you should think of. And the other highlight, which maybe some people always wonder, is there's no default user group that automatically includes all users in an AWS account. So when you have an AWS account and you are creating users in, you don't have any default group that users fall into. You must create a group and you must then assign or put users in that group. There is no, because in some systems, you always have users when immediately they created this, what is called a default group, where any user without a group will belong to. That's not the same in AWS. Just keep in mind that there's no default user group. You have to create every other group. So this is just an example I was trying to bring in. Just imagine that here at WeFund Cloud. Yeah, go ahead, Napoleon.
Could we say the user group admin could be someone with some kind of a root user powers?
User group admin. So user group admin, someone administering the group, not necessarily here. In the context of AWS, it can just be another IAM user, right? That is creating those groups. So okay. The root here will not have that root users, because an IAM admin has permissions to create groups, and that it's just that you can say he has the more powers, for example, but it could also mean that it's the same powers. Yeah. So in this case, it's just and it's an IAM admin user with privileges can create groups, but an IAM admin itself is not having root user permissions. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So in this case, just think of WeFund Cloud. We have a WeFund Cloud AWS account. Remember, this account, we have one root user, which is the account that, which is the user that that was created when you created your account. And this will always, to sign into this account, you will use the email address and the password. Keep that in mind. When you are signing to the root user account, you always use the email that you use in signing up for the account and a particular password. And but then for the IAM user, then when you sign in with the root user account, you create IAM users, right? You can create an IAM user 1, an IAM user 2, an IAM user 3. So you can create many IAM users and give them different privileges. Maybe one could just be have administrator privileges. One could have privileges maybe to manage database. One may have privileges to manage just compute. You see that in the lab that we'll do on Friday, but just try to maybe think about it that way. So in the account, you have different users, but then maybe in ACP1, that is our AWS Cloud Practitioner course, you have people grouped into different groupings. Maybe there are some people here who are accountants, there are some people here who are in healthcare, there are some people here who are in logistics, for example, right? So we have different groups. And we want that people in logistics should have a particular set of permissions. People in healthcare should have particular set of permissions. People in the logistic, say, which is group 3, should have particular set of permissions. Then these users, I've just had 3 here, but they could be maybe 500, right? So maybe you decide that all the first 100 users who belong to the accountant, you put them into the accountants group. The users that are in the healthcare, you put them into in the ACP2 because you think this is for healthcare. And then in logistic, for example, you put all of them here. And then the permissions that you could have been assigning to those individual users, you just assign them to the group. And then all the members that are in each group will be able to have that. So I've just, that still sits here. You have, let's say this is a group of accountants. You create a group for accountants. Then you put, these are the IAM users that you have, Kevin, Kerry, Bree, and Bimi here. And there are more. So you put all of them here into this group, right? And then for the healthcare, you put the users that belong to the healthcare group here. And then, then you assign permissions on this group that are related to the healthcare group, and every user in this group will have that, right? So that is how users and groups kind of align, yeah? So I hope everyone can now have a good understanding there of users and groups and why we need them. We need them to be able to reduce, rather than assigning multiple permissions or going to individual users, you can just put them in a group and you're able to complete that. Now, let's talk about IAM rule. I'll try to move a little bit fast here, but some of the things, so maybe let's just reserve the questions for the end so that we should be able to cover the material for today, but I'll try to be as explicit as I can. So we've talked about IAM users. So when you think of identity and access management, you know what the definition is, right? It controls the access and actually secure access of AWS resources. So IAM will have things like IAM users, know what an IAM user is, know the difference between an IAM user and a root user is, know what is a group, what is an IAM group. You should make sure that you are capturing those definitions. Why do you use an IAM group? What is it for? You should be able to know why you should be able to use an IAM group. The next thing is what is also referred to as an IAM role here, which we have on the screen. And remember when we did talk about an IAM user, I indicated that an IAM user have what is called permanent keys. Some of those permanent, we'll learn more about permanent access keys later on, right? So I did mention, but you have what is called here IAM role, and what we'll come to realize is that an IAM role will have temporary keys. So, but what is an IAM role? An IAM role is just another identity in IAM with some permissions that determine what the identity can and cannot do in AWS. So, and you remember that with an IAM user, it is assigned either to a person or an application. But the difference with an IAM role is that instead of it being associated to a person, it can be assumed by anyone, right? An IAM role just sit there and anyone can assume it. So it's not assigned, there's no fixed assignment for an IAM role to a particular person. It is just sitting there and it can be assigned by anyone who needs that role. So think of an IAM role is similar to an IAM user, but it's just that it has it's not as in this case it's not assigned to a user, so to say. It can be assigned by anyone who needs it. It could be a person, it could also be an application. Then the other thing you should have with an IAM role is that it has temporary keys. It's very important, right? This is always to know this difference. An IAM role will always have temporary keys, and IAM user will have permanent keys. And by assuming a role, when you assume a role, remember we said an IAM role can be assumed by anyone, and when you assume the role, then you then have the access keys will grant that entity, that person, or that application that assumed that role, the permissions that have been assigned to that role. Some IAM role have particular permissions, right? And when you assume that role, you then get those permissions that are assigned to that role. You get to know and understand that better when we do examples, but just notice that the difference here is it's just an identity. So an IAM role is just an identity like an IAM user. It's just sitting there to be assumed by a person or by an application. And then the other thing is, should you use an IAM user and when should you use an IAM role, right? Why do we have an IAM role? Why do we have an IAM user? Why not just use an IAM user? Those are the things that should come in your mind. An IAM user, we said, have permanent keys, but for an IAM role, it has just temporary keys. And you have example where when you are creating applications that maybe is running Amazon Elastic Compute Cloud, that is EC2, and maybe that application needs to access an S3 bucket, that is storage. We'll come to learn more of that later. When it needs to, maybe you have, remember services are always communicating, right? We said that services on their own are just have particular functions, but when you start learning how to combine these services, you start creating, you start solving very complex problems. And in some cases, you may have one service referred to as an EC2 and it needs to communicate to an S3 bucket. Everything goes through, there's always authentication and authorization. So for another service to maybe make a request to another service, it will be better for you to use an IAM role. So IAM role is mostly used when a service wants to communicate with another service. You don't use an IAM user in this case. Not that it's not possible to use an IAM user, but it's just that the best practice and the recommendation is always to have an IAM role so that it's a temporary access, right? It's not a permanent one. So just keep that in mind. I have a link here, which you can read more on some examples of when to use an IAM role and when to use an IAM user. So I'll recommend that when you sit back and you want to read, you can look into this. But I gave this example, which I think you can capture about a service accessing another service. It's always best to use an IAM role. The other thing in IAM that you should think of is what is called an IAM policy, right? We have talked about these things, we have talked about permissions, but how do you grant permissions? Permissions comes through what is called an IAM policy. And an IAM policy is actually a JSON file that has where you can set permissions. So when you attach a policy to an identity or a resource, it will define the permissions they have. So when you think of a policy, what should come to your mind is a set of permissions. As we have, since we mentioned that authenticating is not enough, right? When you authenticate, the next thing is what are you authorized to do? And that authorization is defined in a policy document. So the policy is then the set of permissions that will either say it has the allow or deny, or either say you are allowed to do this or deny. And then apart from being allowed, what are the particular actions? Because there are many things that happen. You could either be uploading a file, you may be downloading a file. So the action of uploading a file is completely different from the action of downloading a file, right? The action of reading a file is completely different from the action of actually writing. So when you are allowed, the next thing, if you are allowed to S3, for example, the other things are what are the actions you can do, and you come to realize that there are so many different actions that you can do on AWS. But when you dig deep, at this point, understanding, especially at the practitioner level, knowing what an IAM policy is almost good enough. But as you study and go more, or for those who are interested to read more, especially on those links I share, you can start seeing that there are many different sets of actions that you come to learn. And of course, this is always on the resource. So a policy always have the effect, which could be allow or deny, the action, which is the permission, and the resource, which is the entity you are controlling. And then it's always something like this. Remember, policies, users always have set of permissions, and they will always receive that from a policy. And users belong to groups, right? And then a policy, you can also apply a policy either to a user, or you can apply a policy to a group, because a policy here will always give the permissions that a group will have, or the permissions that the user will have. The same thing, a policy can be applied to a role. Remember that a role is just similar to a user, but it's IAM user, but it's just that it's different, that it's not assigned to a particular person or application. It's just sitting there to be assumed. And once any entity assume that role, it will then receive the permissions that are applied to that role. So think of policy here as sitting in the middle, and you can apply it to a user, you can apply it to a group, or you can apply it to a role. And then, of course, this is just a reminder that users can always belong into a group. And this is just an example. It may look intimidating at the moment, but most of these things, you come to realize that they are not as intimidating as they are. They're the most basic. If you can, once you sit down, look at it a couple of times, you start getting and understanding what they are. So this is how a policy is always written, right? The effect is to allow, the action is on an S3 bucket. The star here means do anything on an S3. Remember, I was listing that there are completely different things that you can do on an S3 bucket. The resource that you will then specify. So this is just one of the statements in this policy. And here, this is another statement, which is talking here about deny and also the resource you have specified. For the practitioner level, we don't really need to be worried about knowing details how these permissions are, but I just put this here as an example for you to have in mind. Remember, I said a policy is just a set of permissions. So this statement here will be the first set of permission, and this another statement of permission. One is to allow, and one here is to deny, and you see what is actually being denied. But knowing detailing how policies are written is out of the scope of the practitioner course here. But it's something that if you are exploring on your own, I encourage you, because it is a very foundation. IAM is a very foundational service, or it's a core service that if you're going to do well in your cloud journey, you should really learn more into it. So I encourage you to study more if you have that possibility to do so now about just writing permissions, policies.
Excuse me.
Yes, go ahead.
Can you also set this using the policy? Can you set the permission from the root account without really writing all the JSON codes? Can you set them like just manually without going to this JSON file?
Good question. The nice thing that you come to realize is that AWS have some kind of default permissions, right? AWS kind of policies, I should say. So you have AWS policies for, let's say, if you want to give an IAM user administrative privileges, right? AWS already has a policy for that. So you don't need to write, you just need to take that policy and apply to that. So the good thing is AWS kind of already they think ahead of possible policies that people will have, like there are possibly policies that will apply for someone who maybe needs to manage database or someone who needs to manage EC2. So some of those policies, AWS have already created them and are managing them, and all you need to do is just use them. But if you want to write your own policies, which is something you'll learn later on, you can also write them. But there are many policies. Just remind me to show that in our session on Friday. There are many policies that AWS have already created that you can use already without writing from scratch. Yeah.
And I also want to say this JSON file is very, very important, because at work, I've been hearing JSON file, schema, Kafka, but I've never ever seen what they call a JSON file.
Okay.
So when I'm going to see this now, I actually visualize exactly what my developers talk about every day, like JSON.
Yeah.
So it's really very important for me to really see this physically than just sitting down and just listening to what people are saying.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy that spiked your interest. And it's a very interesting course just to know about JSON in general, how this is done. And it's very simple and well explained. It's from Coded Cloud. Please remind me if you have that interest and you just want, it's not about up to 2 hours, but when you do that course, it will start telling you how easy it is to write this. So thanks for your question section, your interest. So just remind me, it's in the document I shared when I was doing the intro of possible courses you can do, but because of your question, I'll reshare that link. And anyone who has 2 hours just to sit and read, to follow what JSON files are and how they write them. The guy actually has very good animations that will make it interesting. I would like to share that for you people to look ahead. Yeah. Thanks for that. We have about 12 minutes to go. Let me try to wrap up a little bit. So let's talk about the multi-factor. What is MFA? Multi-factor, right? Multi-factor authentication is another step in your login process that requires you to enter more information than just your password. So if you must have heard, I mean, there are so many problems that go with user credentials have been compromised. So immediately someone has your username and password, bang, you're gone, right? They can log in and do whatever thing they want to do. But in terms of security, AWS introduced what is called multi-factor authentication, which means that you don't only use your user credentials, that's your username and password. You use also some extra, there's something extra, that will be demonstrated on Friday again, or at least I'll show you how that is done. So when you sign in, you enter your username and password, right? The next thing, I'm sure most of you have experienced that, right? There may be something, you have a code that is then sent for you to confirm either to your email that you are who you are, right? So it's an extra step of login. If you use Amazon for online shopping, they have that. Google also have that in some cases. And all of it is just that, as I say, is just another step in your login process. So when you log in, you may be asked to enter a code, and this code will be sent in your email. So after you type your username and password, then another screen will come up asking you for a code, right? So this code can be sent at times to your SMS, or at times in some places you scan a fingerprint so that it recognizes that it is who you are. So with this extra step, think of it. If someone have your username and password, and is somewhere he signs in, and then that code is sent to an email that only you have access, that person will not be able to access it. So I'm just trying to show how the multi-factor step try to at least help in situations where the username and the password has been compromised. It tries to help prevent unauthorized access. So multi-factor is just an identity and access management best practice that requires second authentication factor in addition to your username and password. And you can always enable the MFA at the AWS account level for the root user and the IAM user. So multi-factor authentication can be applied on the root user, and it's also recommended to apply it on the IAM users that, that you have created. So always, that is the best practice recommended by AWS. Always apply MFA to the root account and to the IAM. So MFA here is always doing something that when you think of MFA, it's always something that you know, and then the authentication is always something that you have. I will also show to you the application which I use for multi-factor authentication. It's just there are different types of them. So think of MFA as the username as password is always something that they know, right? The name and the password that you use. And then the other thing is now something that you have, which is maybe this code that is sent to you. And at times it's something that they are aware it is then now maybe using biometric. And as I said, maybe your fingerprint, or maybe it's reading your eyes. Yeah, I don't know which other example I can give for biometric, but it could be a fingerprint here, yeah, right? Or in some places your eyes are being read. So because we all know these are unique things that belong to each and every one. So let's talk about the different methods of yeah, someone gives Dan, right? That's another thing that you can have. It's used mostly in banking. Thanks for that example, Napoleon. So different MFA methods that you encounter, you have what is called a virtual MFA. This is the one that is popular. It's always a 6-digit numerical code. So when you sign in, for example, you type your username and password, it will ask you for that code. We'll come to that also in our demonstration. So Google have one of those, and I've just had that. Maybe some of you have that or have experienced that. Authy is one that I always recommend that people can use because yeah, you can install it on your phone, you can install it on your desktop, both of them will be synced, so that even if you don't have your phone, you still access it on your desktop, and we'll show you how to install and use that as well. So MFA, this is an example of an MFA device. You have another one which is called the video security key. And this one is just like a USB port that you put on a computer, right? And what happens is when you sign in, it will require you to maybe tap that key. for you to be able to continue with the login process. So it is provided by third-party providers like Ubico, recommended by AWS. So another MFA device that you should know is the FIDO security key, and it's just as you see here. You can put it on a USB port. Then there's another one, it's a hardware MFA. Remember, we had the virtual one, which is software installed. Then there's one which is actually a hard device that you go around with, and it's provided by Taos. It's just, it also generates 6-digit numerical codes. So when you type in your username and password, it will ask you to type the code that is displayed at that time on the device. Remember, these codes will last for about 30 seconds and then they change. So you have to type the code that is being displayed at that time. And when you type the correct code, then it will finally authenticate you, or the sign-in process will be completed. So these are some different MFA devices that you can have. These are some best practices for IAM. I already discussed some of them here. I'll just allow you to read that because I know it is just straightforward. So just take some time. I'll share this and you just read what are best practices for IAM, right? So, and how IAM works, I'll also leave this as, I just included this because maybe someone could be thinking, or I know this is above, maybe trying to understand now completely everything, how everything works. I have a link here, but if you don't understand this, this is just to help you, you know, start, because as I studied and I moved to the associate level and professional level, you start realizing how complex some of these things are, and then you realize that some of these fundamentals of going back on, when you actually when you click something, what really happens, you know, how does the whole authentication flows. So for some of you who want to look further, it's not in the practitioner syllabus, I will say you can try to look at it here. But for sake of time, I just want to deal with how do you interact with AWS services, some of what we have touched, which I know is important, at least for the practitioner syllabus. We have 5 minutes to go. So let's see what we can talk about here. Accessing and interacting with AWS services actually comes in 3 different ways, right? And just keep this in mind, 3 different ways. We'll come to see what the AWS Management Console is. You'll see that on Friday. And also you can see what the AWS command line is. The one that I've never used is the software developer kit, right? So those are the 3 different ways you can access AWS services. The definition of cloud computing, again, is accessing AWS services in an on-demand way. AWS have 200 services. How can you access these services? One way is using the management console, which is kind of a graphical user interface. And this is the one which everyone is familiar with or is comfortable with. It's just like signing to your email. You use a username and a password, and then you go in there. You can then start looking into your emails and seeing and do all the things you can do. The management console for AWS is similar. You sign in with a username and a password, and then you can then have access to all the services. You can see all the services that are listed, and then you can be able to remember after signing, you can be able to use the services if you are permitted, if you are authorized, right? So signing is not enough. The other thing, are you authorized to use those services? And that will be, the authorization will be limited by the IAM policy that is on your user. So we'll look into the AWS Management Console. The other thing is the command line. It is just a unified tool to manage your AWS services, and you can do this right from the command line. The command line interface is just, I don't know. If you have not seen it, no worry, I can show you on Friday. But to be able to use the command line, you need access keys, right? So you need an IAM user with some access keys before you're able to use the command line. The software development kit is still just another application program interface that you can use to access AWS services. And this also requires access keys that are associated to a specific user. So you should take a good note. Remember, I defined what access keys are earlier on, right? It has an access key ID and a secret key ID. So when you're working with the command line, and when you are using the software development kit, you always need to have the access keys that are assigned to a particular user. But when you are working with the AWS Management Console, you just need a username and a password. I want you to capture this difference between this very well, and this diagram maybe will help you. So you have AWS services, all the 200 services maybe sitting in here. The question is, how can I access these services, all of them? If I'm coming from the graphical user interface, I need a username and a password. And if I'm using the command line, I need access keys to do that. And if I'm using, the SDKs, I'm also, which will also is a program interface here, I'll need access keys. So this is, looks so obvious, but and then this one, if you are doing the command line and the SDKs, makes it possible for you to do programmatic access, programmatic calls, because when you come with the command, with the console, you are always, it's graphical, you always, you can make a lot of you can't do programmatic access to your AWS services. But when you want to make programmatic calls, you can use the command line or the SDKs to do that. So that is the other things I want you to capture, how to access AWS. In which way can you make programmatic calls? You cannot do that with the console, but you can do that if you're using the CLI or the SDK. Okay. All right. I hope you did capture that. It's top of the hour, so I've just come here to the lab, and this is the assignment, which I'll share this PDF file. You have to read the global infrastructure, but what I want to recommend for everyone is make sure that you have a Gmail account. If you don't have a Gmail account, I'll recommend that you should create one. Yes, that you can be using for IAM labs, because it's always easy to handle some troubleshooting settings when you know someone has a Gmail account. Sometimes when you don't have, it takes time. And also for this lab, all you need to do is once you click on this link, it will come up. This is the lab we will do on Friday, but I just want you, each and everyone, I encourage you to click and read the entire lab. Just read it, right? And then when you want to sign in, you can click sign in here, and depending if you have your Gmail, then you click on sign in with Google, right? This is important. So if you already have a Gmail account and you are signing to it, it will ask you which one you have to sign into. So for example, I'll pick this one that I have here. I have quite a couple number of Gmail accounts. So if I pick one here, I now have access to the lab. So take time to just read this lab, right? You don't need to sign in to read the lab, because when you sign in, it gives you the possibility to see the start lab button. And then, what I want to encourage you is take time to first read the lab, just read it, right? Try to understand what it is. And if you want to try out, just come and click the start lab, because this will give you the possibility to have access to, I think I have, let me see, there's an error for mine. I hope it won't be for you. Okay, let's see. So see, I have an error, but if I click again, it's loading. So when you click on it, a lab will be provisioned, right? And then you can then be able to go through the lab. It's 45 minutes and the timer will start. I will encourage you people to play with it, make mistakes as you can, but I'll say don't, just do it like if you try 1 or 2 times and it doesn't go, stop, because I know that with these labs, if you sign into a particular Gmail account and you use it a couple of times, very soon you will lose, it won't allow you to access the lab again. But read the lab, try to sign in, try to follow the instructions. They are very clear. Try to see if you can do the lab. Don't be afraid to fail. And then if you have questions, we'll do the lab together on Friday. This is just in preparation for that. And then try to read the global infrastructure. And then, we have some revision questions here. Right. I don't want to, what I will say is, I know in one of the feedbacks, some of you did ask that we should provide as many questions as possible. Yeah, we'll try. At times when we are just starting the session, it's difficult to have questions that will, be just for a particular topic. But yeah, we'll try to have many of those questions. But remember that when we do the first 4 sessions will have a test, right? That will test everyone on what we have covered. That will be an opportunity for you to have at least many questions that you can work on. So thanks for that feedback. I continue to encourage all of you to always complete that survey and ask, maybe highlight things that we can improve on or things that we should address or better explain, and then also rate the presentation and yeah, have a say. That will help us make this better. Yeah. So I would like to stop here and allow that you should do the questions yourself. And if you struggle with, just indicate. The reason is because I know that it's already top of the hour, and I know some of you maybe are preparing to go to work, so I don't want to cheat those of you who are leaving now, and then maybe some of you will be going to bed. But yeah, I'll stop the recording. Did I record? I hope I did. Yes, I'll stop the recording, and if there are any particular